Hurricane Irma is barreling towards the Caribbean with winds reaching 180 miles per hour. The Category 5 storm has prompted hurricane warnings in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Florida is under a state of emergency and preparing for dangerous flooding.
Here to discuss the path of Irma is CBS News weather producer David Parkinson. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
So how serious is the storm?
It is a very serious storm. So to put those 180-mile-an-hour winds in perspective for you, we have not had those winds more than 5 other times in history. This is the tied for the 5th strongest Atlantic hurricane on recorded history. So that shows you just how rare it is. Now, we're not saying it's going to make landfall as a Category 5 or with those winds, but that shows you just how intense that is. And you can look at the radar here. I mean, the satellite shows just an incredibly well-defined eye. The eye has a 25-mile radius, so it's a big eye. It may get a little weaker before it gets a little bit stronger as it goes through eye wall replacement cycles, but it's a very healthy storm. There's no shear to tear it apart. There's incredibly warm water. So what you're looking at is just all the ingredients to keep a strong hurricane moving towards land.
So you said, you're not saying that it'll make it to Miami as a hurricane. It's got to go over some of the Caribbean islands, maybe Cuba. Is there a possibility it may soften a little?
There is a possibility it might soften a little. So right now, the track from the National Hurricane Center takes it past the Dominican Republic, past Puerto Rico as a Category 5. Then it weakens a little bit to a Category 4 as it moves its way towards Cuba. And what we're thinking is going to happen is, at some point, it's going to make a right-hand turn. And you can kind of see that in the official National Hurricane Center track. The point at which it makes that right-hand turn will have everything to do with whether or not it's going to come into contact with the topography of Cuba. Here's the catch. As it goes over the topography of Cuba, that will help tear the storm apart. But if it does that, it's more likely to emerge in the Gulf, which has very warm water, and it's likely to re-strengthen once it does. So that's not to say even if Cuba just tears it apart, it won't be completely, because it can't tear a Category 5 apart completely.
Right.
But even if it tears it apart partially, that's not to say it won't re-strengthen as it moves into the Gulf. And if it doesn't interact with Cuba, the Bahamas, the Turks and Caicos, those islands are flat. It's as if there's no land at all, and they will just basically keep its same intensity as it moves over the water.
So the question is, I have 2 questions. One, how fast is it moving? In other words, when do we expect, if it continues on and doesn't get broken up before it hits the coast of the United States? And I'm guessing that this part of Florida that it's going to circle around is very different than what we just saw last week in Houston. In other words, there are not bayous and rivers and sorts of things that would allow a city to be devastated in the way that Houston and some of the other parts of Texas were.
Right. So let me make something incredibly clear. Let me just directly say this to the camera. This is a very different storm than Harvey. Harvey turned out to be all about the rain. I mean, if you looked at some of the destruction when it happened, made landfall, there were clearly a wind component to it. But everything that you saw in Houston was freshwater flooding. This will not be a freshwater flooding storm worse than any normal hurricane. It's going to move through in 24 to 36 hours. This is a storm about the storm surge along the coast and a storm about the wind. So don't think that there's going to be all these kinds of river flooding and things like that. This is all about your proximity to coastal waterways. And so in that case, storm surges are the most deadly, often, form of effects from a hurricane. So just because it's not going to have freshwater flooding doesn't mean that it's in any way less dangerous. In terms of the timing, so we're looking at Wednesday for Puerto Rico, we're looking at Friday for Cuba, and then we're looking at Sunday as it makes its way towards Florida. It could be somewhere between Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Monday, depending where exactly it makes its landfall. Because, look, it could track up the west coast, it could track up the east coast, it could just graze the Florida coast and then make a landfall in Georgia or South Carolina or something like that. That part we're not quite sure on, because remember, Florida is 100 miles wide where I-75 cuts across the state. So that's a pretty small margin of error to have, especially at 5 days out, and that's why we're going to keep refining that forecast as we get closer.
CBS News weather producer David Parkinson, always good to have you, man. You really make it understandable for those of us who don't have a degree in meteorology. Is that a thing? Degree in meteorology?
Oh, yes.
It actually is. All right. Thanks for stopping by.